Picture yourself standing in an ancient tomb, 4,000 years after its last occupant took their final breath. The golden death mask gleams in your flashlight, hiding secrets that would horrify its creators. You reach out to touch the wrappings of a teenage pharaoh, and suddenly, you understand a terrible truth. This boy didn't die because of illness or accident. He died because his parents were brother and sister. His grandparents were brother and sister. His great-grandparents were brother and sister. Every breath he took was a struggle against the genetic poison flowing through his veins. Imagine growing up knowing you're a living god, but your body betrays you every day. Your spine curves painfully. Your jaw won't close properly. You need a walking stick at age 16. Palace servants whisper about the curse that follows your bloodline like a shadow. You don't understand genetics, that science won't exist for thousands of years, but you know something is terribly wrong with your family. Your parents, your grandparents, everyone you've ever known believes that keeping your blood pure is worth any price. They see your suffering and call it divine. They watch children die in infancy and praise the gods' mysterious ways. They've created a living hell and named it paradise. What if I told you this wasn't fiction? What if I told you that the most powerful people on earth, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, spent 3,000 years systematically destroying themselves through genetic isolation? They believed their blood was divine, too precious to mix with mortals. Instead, they created a laboratory of human suffering that would echo through history. Before we descend into these golden tombs to uncover the truth about Egypt's most tragic rulers, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We're about to travel together through 3,000 years of suffering, and I find it incredible that people from across the world can witness these ancient tragedies together. To understand how the most powerful people on earth became victims of their own making, we must journey back to the beginning of Egyptian civilization. The pharaohs didn't set out to destroy themselves. They thought they were preserving something sacred. They believed their blood was different, divine, a gift from the gods themselves that must never be contaminated by mixing with mortal lineages. Picture the first pharaoh who decided his sister was the only woman worthy of his bed. He looked at his subjects, farmers, craftsmen, ordinary people, and felt revulsion at the thought of his divine essence mixing with their common blood. His priests nodded approvingly. His advisors calculated the political advantages. No one considered the price his children would pay. The logic seemed flawless at the time. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods, the earthly embodiment of Horus, divine descendants of Ra himself. How could a god marry a mortal? How could divine blood be diluted with human weakness? The answer, to every priest and advisor in the palace, was obvious. Gods must marry gods. Brothers must marry sisters. The bloodline must remain pure. What began as religious conviction became cultural obsession. Egyptian royal siblings grew up believing that marrying each other was not just normal, but necessary. They were taught that their bloodline carried the essence of Ra himself, that diluting it with foreign blood would anger the gods and doom the kingdom. Generation after generation, they condemned their own children to suffer for beliefs they never questioned. Each marriage between siblings was like adding poison to a well. The first generation might show only minor problems, a slight jaw irregularity perhaps, or unusual facial features. The priests would interpret these as marks of divine favor, proof that the gods had blessed this union. But the genetic damage accumulated like sediment in the Nile, building layer upon layer until the very foundation of the bloodline became toxic. What started as divine preservation became systematic destruction, but it happened so slowly that no one could see the pattern. A royal child born with a clubfoot, a blessing from the gods. A prince who died at 20, called home to serve in the afterlife. A princess who couldn't bear living children, chosen for higher spiritual purposes. Every genetic disaster was reinterpreted as divine will, every symptom of inbreeding transformed into evidence of godly favor. The Egyptians were brilliant. They built pyramids that still stand today, developed mathematics that amazes modern scholars, created one of the world's first written languages. But they couldn't see what was happening to their royal families because they refused to look. Court physicians documented strange illnesses and early deaths, but never connected them to the obvious cause. They had all the evidence they needed spread across centuries of royal tombs, but their religious beliefs made them blind to the truth staring them in the face. The genetic time bomb was ticking in every palace nursery, in every royal marriage bed, in every prayer offered for the continuation of the divine bloodline. What they thought would preserve their godhood would ultimately prove their humanity in the most tragic way possible. And nowhere was this tragedy more visible than in the royal family that would shock Egypt to its core. In the scorching desert heat of the 14th century BCE, a dynasty would emerge that would take royal inbreeding to its most extreme and most documented conclusion. This is the story of that dynasty, and it begins with one of the most disturbing figures in Egyptian history. In the sweltering heat of 1353 BCE, in a palace overlooking the Nile, a child is born who will grow up to become one of history's most controversial pharaohs. But before Akhenaten becomes the heretic king who abandons Egypt's gods, he is simply a boy trapped in a body that betrays his divine claims. His skull is elongated, stretched like taffy. His hips are wide like a woman's. His chest develops breasts that no amount of royal clothing can hide. The young prince grows up surrounded by servants who avert their eyes and courtiers who speak in carefully measured phrases. Everyone can see that something is wrong with the future pharaoh, but no one dares speak the truth. His reflection in polished bronze shows him a face that doesn't match the god kings in temple paintings. His walk is awkward, his voice strange. Other children, if Pharaoh's children can be called children, watch him with a mixture of fear and pity. The palace becomes a theater of whispered conversations and averted gazes. Servants learn to look past his unusual proportions. Priests craft elaborate explanations for why their future god king looks so different from the divine statues lining the temples. His parents, themselves products of generations of sibling marriage, see their sons' deformities and convince themselves these are marks of special divine favor. After all, the gods work in mysterious ways. When the prince finally becomes pharaoh, he does something unprecedented. He orders artists to portray the royal family realistically. For the first time in Egyptian history, royal art shows elongated skulls, protruding bellies, and strange proportions. Historians call it an artistic revolution, but the truth is simpler and more tragic. The young king is tired of living a lie. If his body is a temple to the gods, then the gods must look exactly like he does. The paintings and sculptures from his reign are haunting. They show a family that looks almost alien. Elongated heads, feminine curves on male bodies, children with the same disturbing proportions as their parents. Modern viewers often assume these are stylistic choices, artistic interpretations. They're not. They're documentation of genetic damage so severe that even royal propaganda couldn't hide it anymore. The heretic pharaoh marries Nefertiti, and together they produce 6 daughters. Court records hint at sons who die in infancy, their small bodies unable to survive the genetic burden passed down through generations. The daughters who live show the same elongated features, the same strange proportions. Palace artists paint them as divine beauties, but servants whisper about the princesses who hide from sunlight and struggle with simple tasks. Perhaps this king's religious revolution, his abandonment of Egypt's traditional gods for worship of a single deity, is born from genetic desperation. If the old gods have cursed his bloodline, maybe a new god will show mercy. He moves the capital from Thebes to a new city, Amarna, abandoning centuries of tradition. He declares himself the sole interpreter of divine will, the only channel between the god Aten and humanity. But even a new god cannot fix genes that have been poisoned for generations. The move to Amarna becomes an exercise in royal isolation. The new capital is built in the desert, far from the traditional power centers of Egypt. The royal family lives in splendid genetic isolation, producing art that documents their deformities while pretending they represent divine perfection. The revolutionary pharaoh dies young, as do most men in his family line. His religious revolution dies with him, abandoned by successors desperate to return to traditional ways. The new capital is deserted, its buildings crumbling under the desert sun. His name is chiseled from monuments, his memory condemned by the very priests whose gods he had abandoned. But the genetic damage continues, passed like a curse to the next generation, to a boy who will become even more famous for his tragic inheritance. The son of this heretic king will inherit not just a throne, but DNA so damaged that his every breath will be a struggle against the accumulated genetic mistakes of his ancestors. The boy enters the world in 1341 BCE, already carrying his father's curse. His name is Tutankhamun, and he will become Egypt's most tragic king. Imagine being 9 years old and struggling to walk while palace servants pretend not to notice your stumbling. The boy king's left foot turns inward, what modern medicine calls clubfoot, making every step an ordeal. His spine curves abnormally, forcing him into painful positions that make sitting on the golden throne an exercise in concealed agony. His chest is malformed, making breathing difficult in Egypt's desert heat. Palace physicians hover around him constantly, but their prayers and potions cannot fix what genetics has broken. The cruel irony of the teenage pharaoh's life is that he is worshipped as a living god, while his body fails him daily. Subjects prostrate themselves before a teenager who needs walking sticks to cross a room. Religious ceremonies designed to showcase divine power become exercises in carefully concealed weakness. Priests chant about the pharaoh's divine strength, while servants discreetly position supports to keep their god-king upright. Court records discovered thousands of years later paint a heartbreaking picture of royal medical intervention. Over 130 walking sticks are eventually placed in the young ruler's tomb, not symbols of divine authority, but desperate aids for a body that can barely support itself. Some are simple canes, others are elaborate golden staffs, but all serve the same purpose: helping a crippled god-king maintain the illusion of divine perfection. The divine child grows up in golden isolation, surrounded by luxury, but starved of genuine human connection. Other children are kept away, partly for his protection, partly to hide his condition from prying eyes. His wife, Akhenaten, is also his half-sister, carrying the same genetic burden that makes their marriage not just incestuous, but practically guaranteed to produce damaged offspring. Their attempts to have children result in miscarriages and stillbirths, tiny mummies found buried with them, silent witnesses to genetic incompatibility. The psychological torture of Egypt's tragic prince cannot be overstated. He grows up surrounded by temple walls covered with images of strong, perfect pharaohs, his ancestors, supposedly, though he must wonder why he looks nothing like them. Court artists tasked with creating his official portraits face an impossible challenge. How do you make a genetic catastrophe look divine? They solve it by avoiding realism entirely, creating stylized images that bear little resemblance to the broken boy on the throne. Palace physicians document the broken pharaoh's condition with meticulous care, creating what modern scientists recognize as the world's first detailed study of inbreeding's effects. They catalog his bone deformities, his immune deficiencies, his hormonal abnormalities. They note his frequent illnesses, his difficulty healing from minor wounds, his struggle to gain weight despite royal abundance. What they cannot understand is that they're documenting the inevitable result of centuries of genetic isolation. At 19, the young king's immune system finally surrenders. A simple case of malaria, the kind that healthy people survive, becomes fatal for a body weakened by genetic damage. As he lies dying in his golden palace, burning with fever that his compromised immune system cannot fight, perhaps he understands what his physicians cannot, that his suffering was not divine will, but the inevitable result of choices made by ancestors who valued political purity over human health. The boy pharaoh dies young and is buried quickly, forgotten by history, until Howard Carter discovers his tomb in 1922. The very genetic damage that made his life a misery also makes him famous. His early death, preserves his tomb intact for modern archaeologists. In 2010, DNA analysis finally reveals the truth his court physicians documented but could never understand. He was the product of sibling incest, a victim of royal policies that treated human beings as breeding stock for political convenience. You might think that Tutankhamun's death would have taught Egypt a lesson about the price of genetic isolation. You might hope that witnessing such obvious genetic catastrophe would make future rulers question the wisdom of sibling marriage. But power has a way of making people forget inconvenient truths, and the allure of pure bloodlines proved stronger than the evidence of their dangers. The story doesn't end with Tutankhamun's death. Instead, it continues across centuries, across dynasties, across the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Because 1200 years later, in the dying light of Egyptian independence, foreign conquerors would look at the same temple walls that had inspired Akhenaten's family, read the same religious texts that justified royal inbreeding, and decide to repeat the experiment that had already destroyed so many lives. This is exactly what happened when Alexander the Great's empire shattered and his general Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his prize. 1200 years after Tutankhamun's tragic death, Egypt falls to Alexander the Great. When Alexander dies in 323 BCE, his general seizes the throne and makes a catastrophic decision. Surrounded by Egyptian temples depicting divine pharaohs married to their sisters, the Macedonian conqueror decides this must be the secret to maintaining power. He doesn't understand that he's about to repeat Egypt's greatest genetic mistake. The foreign rulers aren't Egyptian, they're Macedonian Greeks who view themselves as superior to the people they rule. But they're also practical politicians who understand that Egyptian subjects expect their pharaohs to follow divine tradition. So the dynasty's founder establishes a system where brothers must marry sisters, generation after generation, creating what will become the most concentrated experiment in royal inbreeding in human history. Picture the palace conversations that must have taken place as each generation of royal children grew up knowing their fate. Brothers and sisters raised together, playing together as children, then forced into marriage beds as teenagers. The psychological horror of this system cannot be overstated. These weren't distant arranged marriages with foreign royalty, but intimate family relationships twisted into reproductive obligations. For 300 years, the Macedonian rulers perfect the art of genetic isolation. The family tree becomes a ladder with the same names repeating endlessly. The founder marries his sister, their son marries his sister. Their children repeat the cycle without variation. By the time the dynasty ends, the royal bloodline has become so concentrated that family members are simultaneously cousins, siblings, parents, and children to each other in an impossible tangle of genetic relationships. By the time the legendary queen is born in 69 BCE, the experiment has run for 250 years. Her family tree shows the horrifying result, the same names appearing over and over as brothers marry sisters in an endless cycle. Royal heir marries royal heir. Their children marry each other, generation after generation, repeating the pattern that the Macedonians learned from studying ancient Egyptian practices. The myth of the last pharaoh as a ravishing beauty is probably just that, a myth. After 250 years of intensive inbreeding, she likely inherited the physical characteristics that marked all royal rulers of her line. Pronounced facial features, possible jaw deformities, and the kind of genetic damage that royal propaganda worked overtime to conceal. Her legendary beauty was more likely political necessity than physical reality. What made Egypt's final queen remarkable wasn't her appearance, but her intelligence, one of the few traits that seemed to survive the genetic catastrophe of her bloodline intact. She spoke 9 languages, understood mathematics and philosophy, and navigated the treacherous politics of the dying Roman Republic with skill that would have impressed even healthy rulers. Her brilliance became her compensation for the physical limitations her heritage imposed upon her. The famous queen's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just political alliances, they were genetic lifelines. She desperately needed to introduce new blood into her poisoned lineage. Her children with these Roman leaders represented hope for genetic salvation, a chance to break the cycle of destruction that had consumed her family for centuries. But Roman politics proved even more brutal than Egyptian genetics. Octavian, the future Augustus, couldn't allow rival claimants to survive. The royal children by Caesar and Antony, healthier and stronger than any prince or princess in generations, were systematically eliminated. With their deaths, the last hope for genetic redemption died along with them. When the last ruler chooses suicide over Roman captivity in 30 BCE, she ends not just her own life, but a 250-year genetic experiment in human destruction. Her death by snakebite, if the ancient stories are accurate, becomes almost merciful compared to the slow genetic poisoning that had claimed so many of her ancestors. She dies as the last pharaoh, carrying in her body the accumulated genetic damage of centuries of sibling marriage. The irony is devastating. The foreign conquerors had conquered Egypt militarily, but Egypt conquered them genetically. They came as foreign rulers imposing their will on a subject population, but ended up destroying themselves by adopting the very practices that had doomed their predecessors. The pattern wasn't limited to famous dynasties. Archaeological evidence reveals that royal inbreeding in Egypt wasn't constant, but cyclical. Periods of extreme genetic isolation, followed by recovery when outside marriages brought fresh genetic material, then gradual return to inbreeding as political pressures mounted. Egyptian history shows us a horrifying cycle repeating across millennia. Each time a dynasty grows powerful, it begins to view its bloodline as too precious to mix with outsiders. Political success breeds genetic nationalism, and genetic nationalism breeds dynasty collapse. The evidence lies scattered across Egypt's royal tombs, documented in mummy after mummy, showing the telltale signs of inbreeding damage. Even in Egypt's earliest dynasties, we find evidence of occasional sibling marriage among pharaohs. Tomb inscriptions and royal genealogies hint at the practice during the pyramid-building era, though not as systematically as later periods. The genetic foundation for future disasters was being laid stone by stone, burial by burial, marriage by marriage. After the Old Kingdom's collapse, Middle Kingdom pharaohs often married foreign princesses, bringing fresh genetic material into royal bloodlines. For several centuries, the practice of sibling marriage nearly disappeared. Royal children during this period show fewer signs of genetic damage in their mummified remains. Egypt prospered politically, and its royal genetics recovered accordingly. But power breeds arrogance, and success breeds genetic nationalism. By the New Kingdom period, pharaohs like Akhenaten's family had returned to extreme inbreeding. The Amarna period represents perhaps the most concentrated example of sibling marriage outside the later Ptolemaic dynasty. The artistic evidence from this era, those elongated skulls and unusual proportions, documents genetic damage in real time. After the Amarna collapse, later dynasties again turned to foreign marriages for political alliances. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs married Nubian, Libyan, and Near Eastern royalty. The genetic diversity improved, and so did dynasty stability. Royal mummies from this period show healthier bone structure, longer lifespans, and fewer obvious deformities. But when the Ptolemies arrived, they brought their own obsession with bloodline purity, creating the final and most extreme chapter in Egypt's genetic tragedy. Each cycle taught the same lesson. Genetic diversity brings strength, isolation brings destruction. Yet each new dynasty seemed doomed to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors, as if the very power of ruling Egypt carried with it an irresistible urge toward genetic self-destruction. These repeated mistakes weren't just political failures. They were human tragedies played out in palace bedrooms and royal nurseries. To truly understand what this genetic self-destruction actually meant, we must imagine what their daily lives felt like. Modern genetics helps us understand their conditions, but the human experience remains heartbreakingly real across the millennia. Picture waking every morning in a palace of gold and marble, surrounded by servants who call you divine, but your spine screams with pain before your feet touch the floor. Your jaw aches from the simple act of eating breakfast. Your breathing is labored from a chest that never formed properly. You are worshipped as a god, but your body reminds you constantly that you are more fragile than the poorest peasant working in the fields outside your palace walls. Royal children grew up understanding they were different, but not why. They couldn't play with normal children, couldn't form genuine friendships, couldn't escape the golden prison of their bloodline. Their only companions were siblings who shared their genetic burden, cousins who would become spouses, relatives who reflected their own deformities back at them like funhouse mirrors. Imagine growing up in a world where everyone you love looks wrong, and you look wrong too, but no one can explain why. The isolation of divine status created its own psychological torture. These children lived in magnificent palaces, but were prisoners of their own genetics. They had access to the finest food, but their malformed jaws made eating painful. They owned libraries of scrolls, but many struggled with the learning difficulties that often accompany inbreeding. They were surrounded by luxury, but luxury cannot fix bones that grow crooked or hearts that struggle to pump blood through damaged vessels. As these royal children grew older, they began to understand the pattern. They saw the portraits of ancestors with similar features, the elongated skulls, the protruding jaws, the strange proportions that marked their bloodline. They noticed that royal infants died more often than commoners' babies. They realized that their divine bloodline was actually a curse, but religious and political necessity demanded they perpetuate it with their own children. For royal women especially, every pregnancy became a gamble with death. Would this child be born alive? Would it survive its first year? Would it be so deformed that even royal propaganda couldn't hide the truth? Palace records hint at the psychological toll this took. Royal mothers who retreated from public life after multiple pregnancy failures, queens who refused to appear at religious ceremonies, women who sought comfort in wine and opium to numb the pain of watching their children die. Modern genetics explains what the ancient world could never understand. When siblings reproduce, their children have a 25% chance of inheriting 2 copies of any recessive gene. In a healthy, genetically diverse population, harmful recessive genes are rare and usually masked by normal copies inherited from unrelated parents. But when generation after generation of siblings marry siblings, these harmful genes accumulate and compound like interest on a debt that can never be repaid. The visible evidence was everywhere, documented in art and preserved in mummies. The characteristic jaw deformities that we see in Egyptian royal portraits weren't artistic choices. They were genetic reality becoming impossible to hide. Elongated skulls, unusual facial features, and physical deformities that artists portrayed as divine attributes were actually genetic defects becoming more pronounced with each generation of inbreeding. But the invisible damage went much deeper. What ancient art couldn't show were the internal problems. Immune systems so compromised that minor illnesses became fatal, hormonal imbalances that affected growth and development, neurological issues that may have influenced personality and behavior. The genetic damage penetrated every cell, every organ, every system in their bodies. Each generation of inbreeding made the next generation more vulnerable. What began as minor facial irregularities became severe jaw deformities that made eating difficult. What started as occasional infant deaths became routine pregnancy failures that devastated royal mothers. The genetic damage accelerated over time, creating a spiral of destruction that royal families couldn't escape because they couldn't understand its cause. The pharaohs thought they were preserving divine purity, but they were actually conducting the world's longest and most tragic experiment in human genetics. An experiment that turned palaces into laboratories of suffering and transformed god-kings into victims of their own beliefs. This tragic experiment wasn't a single continuous disaster, but a pattern that repeated across millennia. What we see across Egyptian history isn't continuous inbreeding for 3,000 years, but rather periods of intense genetic isolation, followed by recovery, then repetition. The Old Kingdom pharaohs occasionally married sisters. The Amarna period under Akhenaten represents an extreme phase. Then, after centuries of more diverse marriages, the foreign rulers created the most concentrated example of royal inbreeding in human history. This cyclical nature of royal genetic destruction reveals a terrifying pattern. Each time a dynasty grows powerful, it begins to view its bloodline as too precious to mix with outsiders. Political success breeds genetic nationalism, and genetic nationalism breeds dynasty collapse. The evidence lies scattered across royal tombs, documented in mummy after mummy, showing the telltale signs of inbreeding damage. Even in the earliest dynasties, we find evidence of occasional sibling marriage among pharaohs. Tomb inscriptions and royal genealogies hint at the practice during the pyramid-building era, though not as systematically as later periods. The genetic foundation for future disasters was being laid stone by stone, burial by burial, marriage by marriage. After the Old Kingdom's collapse, Middle Kingdom pharaohs often married foreign princesses, bringing fresh genetic material into royal bloodlines. For several centuries, the practice of sibling marriage nearly disappeared. Royal children during this period show fewer signs of genetic damage in their mummified remains. The kingdom prospered politically, and its royal genetics recovered accordingly. But power breeds arrogance, and success breeds genetic nationalism. By the New Kingdom period, pharaohs had returned to extreme inbreeding. The Amarna period represents perhaps the most concentrated example of sibling marriage outside the later foreign dynasty. The artistic evidence from this era, those elongated skulls and unusual proportions, documents genetic damage in real time. After the Amarna collapse, later dynasties again turned to foreign marriages for political alliances. For centuries, pharaohs married Nubian, Libyan, and Near Eastern royalty. The genetic diversity improved, and so did dynasty stability. Royal mummies from this period show healthier bone structure, longer lifespans, and fewer obvious deformities. But when the Macedonian conquerors arrived, they brought their own obsession with bloodline purity, creating the final and most extreme chapter in this genetic tragedy. Each cycle taught the same lesson. Genetic diversity brings strength, isolation brings destruction. Yet each new dynasty seemed doomed to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. The end came only when scientific understanding made the consequences undeniable. Royal inbreeding began ending when genetic knowledge replaced religious superstition. Today, we know what ancient royals couldn't. Genetic diversity isn't contamination, but protection. Every harmful gene in human DNA is balanced by genetic variation. When that variation disappears through inbreeding, the hidden genetic damage becomes visible and deadly. This scientific knowledge came too late for the pharaohs, but their sacrifice gave us wisdom. Come back with me now to that golden tomb where we began this journey. Look again at Tutankhamun's death mask, but this time, see past the divine symbolism to the human tragedy beneath. This wasn't just art. It was a desperate attempt to hide the genetic reality of a boy whose every breath was a struggle against the accumulated mistakes of his ancestors. If these ancient pharaohs could speak to us across the millennia, what would they say? Perhaps the heretic king would warn us about the price of religious fanaticism. Maybe the boy pharaoh would plead for others to value human health over political purity. The last queen might urge us to choose love over lineage, genetic diversity over dynastic pride. Their genetic material, preserved in mummies and analyzed by modern science, tells a story more powerful than any hieroglyphic text. They wanted to be remembered as gods, but they became humanity's greatest teachers about the importance of genetic diversity. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if we learn from it. The pharaoh's tragedy reminds us that no amount of political power, religious authority, or cultural tradition can override the basic laws of biology. They thought they were preserving something sacred, but they were actually destroying the very thing they sought to protect. Their genetic legacy became their genetic curse. These rulers who obsessed over bloodline purity became the strongest argument for genetic diversity in human history. Their mummies, studied by scientists, have taught us more about genetics than any textbook. Their pain became our knowledge, their suffering our wisdom. As we leave their tombs and return to our modern world, we carry their stories with us. We remember them not as divine kings and queens, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate their genetics and culture conspired to give them. Their voices, silenced by death and time, still echo with a simple message: choose humanity over ideology, health over tradition, love over power. Remember us, they whisper from their golden tombs, and learn from our mistakes, so others might be spared the curse we could never escape.